thank you for joining me today. This is another podcast, this time with Professor Paul Hollins of Cultural Research, the School of Arts and Centre of Technology at the University of Bolton. How are you today?
Good morning. I'm really good.
Good. You look really good today.
Yeah, I'm feeling good today.
Nice to see smiley faces. I feel like we're perhaps coming through all this doom and gloom, and we've got smiley faces again.
Yes, well, I think you have to retain a smile.
You do, absolutely. So you're aware of my conversations with different academics, and it's talking about educational journeys. So Thank you so much for agreeing to meet with me today. And that's how I want to start, is to talk to you about how education has been for you and how you've got to where you've got to.
Yeah, I don't really want to bore you, but I wouldn't say that I've had a conventional educational journey in any sense. It's kind of a real diversity of experience. And I think as a Bolton professor, that's not untypical, that we've all had these unique journeys. But when you talk to me, you'll see that I've probably done lots of things that you wouldn't have expected me to do.
I hope so.
I think so. Yeah.
That's why it's been really interesting talking, because I think you're absolutely right. I said, everybody that I've spoken to from Bolton, there is no typical journey. I think I went into this thinking, it's just high school, A-levels, university, boom, you're an academic. And it's just not been, which has been really good.
Yeah. Well,
high school with me.
Yeah, I started off, it really, I think, how did kind of my educational experience develop? And whilst I'm a professor in the arts and creative technologies, I've worked specifically in education for many, many years in educational research. So what shaped it is quite, I was what I would describe as a typical 1960s kid. I went to, my first school actually was a new build school, I remember, called Woodfield School in Harrogate. And it was very, very flash because it was new build. I didn't come from a particularly wealthy family or a nice area. It was probably the worst area in a very smart town, if you know what I mean. So I wasn't deprived in any sense, but I came from a very, very strong working class family with what I would describe then as working class ideals. My dad was a postman, but more than that, when I was young, he was a very active union representative. Okay. And my mum worked in a sweet shop, which was the coolest thing in the world when you were 4 or 5.
Did you get free sweets?
Well, at Easter, we used to get, telling experience, when Easter eggs were left over, they would smash them up and sell them as broken chocolate. And we would get these boxes of broken chocolate. So, yeah, I got loads and loads of chocolate. That's the one thing that I was spoiled at when I was a child. And, of course, chocolate is currency when you're a young kid. There's lots you can do with chocolate.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
But chocolate now, though? Or is it like a chocolate?
Not in any sense. I mean, Woodfield was a strange place because there were real radical movements in the 1960s in terms of education. In the liberal sense, and that school was I guess quite representational of those radical changes in education, that move away from the strict Victorian disciplinarian system that had existed for 80, 90 years since the establishment of formal education. So we got kind of hippie teachers, which was really quite strange. Now, my first memory of that is my mum actually being really upset that I wasn't getting a good education, because it wasn't the education that she'd got or my dad had got. And so they pulled me out of that school.
Really?
Yeah, because it was too radical.
What was it that was radical to them?
Well, I think what you got is, at those times, you got a lot of the female teachers would turn up with, flowers in their hair and beads and dresses that were free flowing. The male teachers and there were male teachers in primary schools in those days, which I know is a problem we're trying to address now, were kind of bearded, guitar-loving, Jimi Hendrix kind of, well, a bit earlier than Hendrix actually, but those kind. So, and I think they believed in kind of children developing at their own pace. So some radical work that came out of that time. I mean, I later refer to Deschooling Society by Ivan Illich as it's quite inspirational to me in terms of my views on education. I didn't know that then, but I was kind of living through it at that time. So they moved me to this, what I would describe as the most traditional primary school that you would ever see. It was Bilton Grange Primary. The head teacher I thought was ancient. He was probably only 60, but he looked, he was very, very old. And my mum had gone to that school and he'd been the head teacher then, in the 1930s, 40s, I think he'd started. And it was very, very traditional. For instance, it was a mixed school, but you had separate entrances for boys and girls.
Wow.
And if you went near the girls' entrance, you'd get the slipper. That was the punishment. Mm-hmm. And similarly, if the girls went near the boys' entrance, they didn't get the slipper. We didn't get equal punishments. I seem to recall that. But it was a very traditional school. We played cricket, which for what you would describe as a state primary school, people have this idea that cricket was for an elite, for kind of private schools, which is it's emerged that way. Then we played cricket at the local cricket ground every Wednesday. We were taught our times tables through drill, through repetition, and it's kind of stayed with me. And after sort of struggling a bit at Woodfield and not really doing anything, because I think I was inherently lazy, bizarrely, I kind of responded to this disciplinarian regime, and that I was reasonably intelligent. In those days they would stream primary school kids. They don't do it now, but so I was always in quote unquote the top set, the clever kids, and I was pushed. I really, really pushed by. I mean, my teacher, my last teacher in primary school, was Mr. Buttress, who'd been a sergeant major in the army in the Second War, and a policeman, no disrespect to policemen, in previous careers. And he was teaching 10-year-olds, and you would come in and you would have to fold your arms and yes, sir, no, sir. Absolutely. And my lasting memory from that class, though, is interesting in that was one of the other students in the class rebelled. And my lasting memory from primary school was this 11-year-old having a fight with Mr. Buttress.
An actual fight? Oh,
yeah. It was full on, because I think it just pushed him too far. And the child didn't even get expelled nowadays. Basically it was outside the headmaster's office, and things went on as normal. Which, yeah, but it was a full on. Well, if a 10-year-old can punch a 6'2" ex-sergeant major, then he attempted. Let's put it that way. But that was the highlight of my primary school, being sat 2 seats away from this disruption. But it was a very, very good school. It was a very, very strict school, and it didn't really reflect any of the contemporary or liberal teaching that was changing in the world. And I'm talking about the late 60s and the early 70s. And so, yeah, it was a formative experience. Then I went to what are now termed rather derogatory, a box standard comprehensive school. And it was suddenly back out of the discipline into the free love again. It was very, very liberal. So, we got all these mixed messages when I was at school about it was the hangover from colonial rule, empire, discipline, Britain. We won the Second World War single-handedly, kind of that view to more radical challenge to those hierarchies that occurred in the late 60s, I think, throughout society. And so, my school reflected that. I had in that school some teachers that were of that old ilk, that were very, very disciplined, mixed in with these free radical teachers. My English teacher, talking about inspiration, and I one thing I will do is I'll tell you that I think my journey is, as everyone's has been littered with inspirational people. I've been really, really lucky that I've worked with people that have been brilliant in very, very different ways. And I had, in the second year at secondary school, or the comprehensive school, I had an English teacher who was absolutely brilliant. He was inspirational to me in my educational journey. And I was, as you'll perhaps find out if we do get time, if we don't go over 2 hours, because I'll talk forever, I was, English was a subject. I was very, very disruptive at school. And I think that's consistent with others you've interviewed here, that I talked too much, I didn't do what I was told, and I became quite bored with a lot of school. And I know that somebody else has said the same thing. But my English teacher, who was called Mr. Clough, or rather, we called him Rocky, because he had a Triumph motorbike and he had hippie hair. Yeah, he once took me aside because I was getting into all sorts of trouble, and he was my form tutor. And he said, "Look, Paul," he said, "your character will get you through life. I'm not worried about you at all. Ignore them." And I thought, teachers aren't supposed to say that to you. They're supposed to tell you off. And I'll give you one example of teaching that really left a mark on me. I was a know-it-all. I was mouthy. I was a disruptive kid. I wasn't particularly very nice. I was awkward, and I wasn't the kind of child that you wanted in your class if you were a teacher. I really wasn't. I was arrogant. I was loud, disruptive, and there was an English.
I feel like this is describing my son right now. I'm so sorry.
well, that might be a good thing, yeah. And I remember, this is how it was. I remember the class as like it was yesterday, and we were in English literature, which we did, and we were discussing, or rather reading and discussing, Romeo and Juliet. And my attitude to it was, forgive me now, I take this back now, in my rather ignorant and stupid and arrogant teenage years. Romeo and Juliet's crap. I'm not interested in it. And so I was bored in the class, and I was throwing things. I was punching people, and doing all sorts of. And Rocky, the teacher, or Mr. Clough, as he's supposed to be called, noticed this, and he let me just go away with it for a little bit. And then after about 10 minutes of it, I could see the other kids were getting a bit fed up of me, and they were trying to learn. "Oh, Paul, would you just come here a second?" He never said, "Here now," or shout at you. "Yeah, all right." He said, "Come down here." And he took me quietly in front of the class. He said, "Paul, don't you like this?" "No, it's crap." Well, he said, "All right, okay." He says, "Don't bother." He said, if you don't want to do it," he said, "that's okay by me." He said, "Actually, I don't like Shakespeare. I find it's crap as well." Oh, I thought, English teacher. He said, "Look, don't worry about it. Do what you want to do. Don't worry, mate." And of course, it nullified that kind of aggression that I had and that wanted to be noticed. So I was fairly quiet. And then at the end of the lesson, he said, "Oh, just come here again." He said, "Paul," he said, "look, I can see that doesn't do it for you." He said, "You don't have to do this lesson anymore." And I went, oh, right. He said, oh, you know, he said, you don't want to do it. He said, I get that. That's fair enough. So he said to me, he said, Paul, look, I tell you, he said, I'm really interested in what you said. He said, you reckon Shakespeare's crap? He said, rather than do the lesson, he said, why don't you, when we do our assignment 2 weeks' time, just come and tell the class why Shakespeare's crap. Wow. And I thought, oh, I've got away with it. That's cool. So what did I do? I went and read bloody Shakespeare. Of course I did. And I thought, and I did this little thing. And then I presented to the class about why Shakespeare was crap. But what it was a critique of Romeo and Juliet, which is exactly what the lesson was. But it was very, very clever in the way that he'd freed me from those kind of constraints and said, yeah, okay, tell us why it is. And that stayed with me. That stayed with me all of my life. Other than, again, my 3B physics report is probably a little more typical. And I can remember it verbatim. And I used to have it when we had offices on my desk there as an inspiration. And this was from a Mr. Wallace, a physics teacher. And Mr. Wallace said, 3B physics. Paul is very talented, but uses it in a very odd way that will not allow him to achieve anything in life. Paul is more the apprentice to the court jester than a student of physics. Now, teachers wouldn't write a report like that now.
No, they wouldn't.
You can see it made a mark on me. It really did.
So how did you respond to that?
Well, when I got it, I was quite proud of it, and I still am really, really proud of it. But what he'd noticed, he was a very traditional teacher. He wasn't a very good teacher, if I'm honest. And I became bored, and so I resorted to kind of displacement activities. I wasn't interested in education, and then the last 2 years that I was in comprehensive education, I'll be honest, I attended very little. I had a very poor attendance record. They call it play truant now. I even got a job, can you believe it, with the council over one winter clearing snow, because I told them I was 16 because I was quite tall. And I mean, you wouldn't get away with that kind of thing now. So I used to get paid for clearing the snow up off the council roads, and I'd be about 15.
So you'd rather do that than go to school?
When I should have been at school, because I told them I was 16 and I'd left school. And I don't suppose in those days anybody bothered checking, really, because I am 6'3", I'm big. I was big then and quite strong. But my great love of that period was punk. And I took time off. I loved punk. I followed the Sex Pistols, the band around, and then I got a bit of a part-time role really with helping and following a band called Susie and the Banshees. And so I developed this great love of punk music, which, much to the displeasure of my father, that'll get you nowhere in life. You won't, you're wasting your life away. I spent 5 years doing nothing at school, really, the comprehensive school, other than we did O-levels in those days, ordinary levels, and I passed all my O-levels. And everybody was, after telling me for 5 years I wouldn't do anything, I just turned up for the exams.
Yeah. And
I passed them. So maybe I did do something, I don't know, but I didn't find it difficult. And then I was encouraged, oh, you must stay on. You must stay on at school. We want you to do your A-levels. I didn't do them. I've only got one A-level, which I got by accident, which is a comical story. But I never went to sixth form college or stayed on at school. I left. And originally I left, I thought I would get a job roadieing with a band. That's what I thought. And I'd been promised a job. Anyway, that band split up. And so I thought, what the hell do I do? because I'd kind of quit school. I was in the middle of nowhere. I literally was. I was 16. I kind of left home, really.
Really?
And what did I do? And I literally went into a military recruiting office, which, you know, Clash wrote a song about it. You know, it's either in the dock or in the military, you know, for kids in the 70s. And it was. And I thought, well, that sounds okay. I get fed. I get a roof over my head. So I joined the Navy when I was 16.
Wow.
Which was fun. And I joined the Navy, and I remember sat in the military careers office. And in those days, you kind of went in, and 2 weeks later, you were in. It wasn't like a year or 6 months. You did this test. And I remember I hadn't got the results of my O levels. In fact, it was just 16. I hadn't even got the results at that time. They didn't come through for about 6 months. And they said, oh, you have to do this English and maths test. And anyway, I did very well in the test. And they said, oh, you can be whatever you want to be. You can be an artificer, which was an engineer, if you want. Anyway, the kind of officer went out, and the petty officer was in there. And I said to him, I said, what's the easiest job in the Navy? And he said, why? I said, well, what's the easiest job in the Navy? He said, well, the easiest job is to be a stores accountant. So anyway, the officer came back in and said, well, do you want to be an engineer? And you'll then, no, I said, I want to be a stores accountant. And he looked at me. Why? I said, no, that's what I want to do. I've always wanted to be a stores accountant. So I joined as a stores accountant. And anyway, I did my basic training. I did the specialist training. And I ended up it was a little bit mind-numbing when I'd done the training. And so I ended up doing photography in the end. Anyway, I spent 6 years in the Navy, traveling the world. I saw most of the world, lots of places you wouldn't want to see, but it's a great upbringing when you are an arrogant, noisy 16-year-old and you are put in a mess with 70 men who, some of them were in their 40s and had been around, you know, around Korea and the Korean War and were, let's put it this way, quite hardened. And in those kind of institutional environments, you very, very quickly learn how to behave. Otherwise, yeah, and you know, you'll know what institutions are like. Thinking
about that, thinking of how the three different educational journeys you've had there. The liberal one at primary school, then sort of drifting back into that in high school. Then you've got the disciplinarian one, and now the Navy. How different are they all, and which one do you think actually worked for you?
Well, it's interesting. I think a combination of them all worked, because what I did, I began to recognise the value in a more liberal education, but I also recognised, and I hate saying this because it is so unfashionable, but I recognised the value of self-discipline. And one thing the military did teach me, whilst it is imposed discipline when you're training, the Navy's quite liberal, actually, or it was in those days, in that when you went to sea, there was very little of what you would describe as institutional discipline. It was self-regulated. The officers didn't tell you what to do because you were expected to know what to do.
Yeah.
And you weren't mollycoddled in any sense. You were literally thrown in the deep end. I mean, at 18 years of age, I was in the South Atlantic, in the Falklands, which is quite an experience. And it was funny in some kind of way. It gave me, I could talk to the older generations on an equal level. Oh, we were in the war and well, yeah, okay. I kind of get that now. And so, yeah, that was, and I always said later life in education that and I worked particularly in technology and learning for many years. And I said to somebody, oh, you seem to be very calm about all of this, Paul. And people tell you in the university, I don't get flustered. I'm quite a calm person. And I said, well, when you've been through that, nobody dies in technology. It's all relative.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I kind of went through that, and I think that was a great. I look back now as a great learning experience. It gives you a bit of humility, and it gives you a great love for people, and I think that's important. And I sound kind of like a tree-hugging hippie, and I am vegetarian, so there's another thing. I wasn't in those days. I didn't know what a vegetarian was. I thought it was something you ate. Not something you were. It was, and I guess it's those extremes and those. I really enjoyed my time, and I was pretty successful in the military. Most of the time, it was the Cold War, and I was shadowing Russian ships. So I can still tell you the displacement of every Russian cruiser from 1979, if you're interested in it. But
maybe next time.
Yeah, maybe next time. Not for this one. And so, that was what I did.
6 years, did you say? 6 years in the military?
Yeah, that's right. Right in the middle of the Cold War, Falklands. I went over to Northern Ireland as well. As it was Camp Moscow, which was in Belfast. I did work there. Challenging environments for a young person to be in.
Yeah, definitely.
Quite. But a great grounding for your life, I think. And everything becomes manageable. And I still kind of adopt so many of the techniques that I learned in the military. And bizarrely, with the advent of social media, it's quite interesting, actually, because I reconnected with lots of people that I knew from those times. And it's really, really interesting to see what they've become. And I have to say, I'm a little bit unusual in that most of those that I served with are very fine, kind of staunch, I would say, on the right side of politics, as in geographically the right side, and politically on the right side. And I'm very much on the other side, on the socialist side of politics. They can't quite understand that you would, I'm a so-called soft lefty, but why I would have military service. And it's quite interesting when I'm challenged now in speaking by, and quite often I am, about those on the conservative and right side of politics, that I would have such strong socialist views. But they were fashioned a lot by my father, really, when I think about it, who was a trade union representative in the late 60s and fought for quite significant change in employment law at a very senior level. I always tell the story of coming home on my bike from Cubs one night, and I went to Cubs, and putting my little bike outside the back door, walking into our back kitchen, and there were 3 people in the back kitchen eating their fish and chips out of newspaper, which is what they did.
Yeah.
One of them was my dad, of course. The other was a guy called Tom Jackson, and if anybody's old enough or you Google it, you'll see that he was a very strong union leader with a big handlebar moustache who lived in Ilkley, which was near where we were, and a lesser-known union leader of the Yorkshire miners called Arthur Scargill.
Who was that?
Yeah, and they were all sat at my kitchen table.
Really?
And at the time, they were, quote unquote, plotting the downfall of the Heath government.
Wow.
It was that kind of struck me. So maybe I think my socialist values kind of emanate from that my dad was one of 14 children. My mum was
14.
Yeah, my mum was from 9, and my mum's upbringing now you would describe as abuse by her father was a horrible man, and they were sent to steal coal from the railway line to put on the fire by their dad, little girls. And when you've gone through that, I've nothing but admiration for my mum, who kind of pulled herself out of that life and had a really nice life and did well for herself. And so probably the biggest influences there are my mum and dad, and my dad died recently, which has kind of brought it to the fore, really. All the things he kept every letter I'd written to him for 40 years. When I was in the military, and I've just rediscovered them.
That must be quite emotional reading them.
Well, it was. I mean, one of them was strange. We were talking about death, and my dad's mum had obviously died, my grandmother, and I was away at sea, and I'd written to my father, and I'd said, "I was sorry to hear about my grandma dying, but we've all got to go sometimes," And I'm thinking it's kind of a typical black military humour response, isn't it? Yeah. You deal with that because you see adversity, and you get on with it. And I guess that, and people think that's at odds with a socialist doctrine, but it isn't. I believe in personal responsibility, but I believe we have a responsibility for others, and to care for others.
Yeah.
And that for me is socialism. It's not a political doctrine about being anti-business or anti-making money. I've had a very successful life in those regards. But yeah, and then through the 80s, I.
So on that point, you've just left the army. What happens to you next? Where do you go?
No, the Navy, not the army. Don't.
Oh, the army, didn't I? The Navy. I'm so sorry.
Yeah. Well, at that point, I went and I started working in a design business, and I describe it as project managing. So that was graphics and interiors and the arts, and I did that for a few years, and I enjoyed that. That was great, but then decided to go and live in Australia.
Wow.
So I moved to Australia. I did a kind of similar thing in Australia, but there was a moment that I then thought I was kind of missing the education bit. I was mature, I was much more interested. So I went to study around areas in management studies in Australia, and I did that. And I became, for my sins, the youngest ever chair of a professional football club in Australia.
How?
That happened. I played football all my life. And in those times, so I actually became, as part of it, I did a course as my degree is in sports administration, or one of my degrees was. So I did a degree in sports administration. I ended up being the chair of a club that had risen a little bit like Wimbledon from the bottom of the pile to the top. And if you were sensible and you showed a little bit of intelligence, in football, you generally achieve, I think. And then I ended up, because of that role, being on a national group that were looking. Australia had huge issues with ethnic tensions, and this was about the time of the Balkans War. And so we had Macedonians, Croatians, Serbians, and different football teams that had. There was a European war going on, and of course these were playing football against each other in Australia. As you can imagine, it's quite a tense situation. So there was a panel established by which we try and and resolve these tensions, because the government said, well, we ban any ethnic names on football teams. So you had a team like Fremantle, Croatia, Dianella, Serbia. You had to drop the name. But the problem was, and I was invited onto the committee, and why they'd got this kind of white English bloke, I have no idea, but they'd asked me to be on it. So I looked at these different groups, and the problem was the football club was actually the centre of the community, and it was the hub. And so many of them had moved to Australia and had very little other than their own community. And so that these were hubs, they weren't just football clubs. You were basically saying your Serbian identity or your Macedonian identity is extinguished, it doesn't exist. And so they were not happy about this, as you can imagine. And so I spent a lot of time trying to work to improve that situation. Bit of a thankless task, really, most difficult thing I've ever done. And I remember being by a group, sat with a chair of a Macedonian club and a Serbian club, right in the middle of the Balkans War, and their families were killing each other in Europe. And me saying, you've got to get on and play football and be nice to each other. And it wasn't an easy thing to do. So what that taught me was it taught me how to negotiate. Because if you try and meet a middle ground there, and I became actually really interested in game theory, which I won't go into in here, but game theory was adopted by Kissinger in the Arab-Israeli war as a negotiation technique. And your starting point is, well, what do we agree on? Well, we don't agree on anything. You've got Macedonians and Serbians. Well, we do agree on something. We agree that we do agree. And we agree. And then you start working your way through. And then when I left Australia and came back to the UK, I'd asked the chair of one of the clubs, and he wrote me the most beautiful reference I've ever had. And he'd said that he'd never met anyone that had managed to bridge those two communities so effectively as I didn't think I'd done anything. But he said to do it with respect when your communities are disrespected was, and honestly, it's the nicest thing anyone has ever written about me. His name was Tom Mijatovic, and he was a lawyer, actually, and he was a very powerful man, and he wrote this lovely reference, and I didn't even ask him. I just said, "Oh, would you say that I worked on the ethnic diversity committee for Soccer Australia?" "Oh, yeah. He said, I'll do it." And he wrote, it's fantastic. I've still got it. But again, you learn an awful lot about dealing with quite disparate groups with disparate problems, and a lot about respect, because I had gone into those discussions not really understanding Macedonian or Serbian culture. I also spent some time, I was asked by the Australian government through the Member of Parliament for Joondalup, which was a city in Western Australia, to spend some time with an Aboriginal tribe, which I did. So I went in the outback for a little while to study their society, or Aboriginal society, which is still an Australian great shame. I wouldn't even wish to start talking about Aboriginals and their fate in Australia. So I studied, I did all of those quite interesting things. I came back, and I guess industry had evolved, and whilst it was graphics, it became more technology and computer based. This was early 90s. Mid 90s. So I came back to the UK and ended up working for an Australian company in the UK who worked in multimedia. I'd been transferred back from Perth to where I lived in the UK. And so I became involved in development of multimedia, and I ended up, that company was bought out by an expanding games company called Midas, and I ended up as international director of licensing for Midas. In the 90s, we grew from a small company to a multi-million pound international publisher of games. So I worked in the games industry, in licensing, in contracts and negotiation. And whilst I was doing that, I was studying. I did an MBA at Leeds Business School. I did an MSc in teaching and learning. And so I was very busy during that time. And there was kind of a moment one day where I was at E3, which is an international exposition of games. And I'd seen a demonstration of a game, and there was a 10-year-old child playing this game. And I thought, there's a lot going on here. There's a lot of very complex parallel processing. There's a lot of learning. And there has to be potential in digital technologies to teach. And it actually was one of those moments. And so I, at that point, took a decision, and that's where I became really interested in the power of education to change lives. And so I left the games industry and took a job as head of business development for a company called Bradford Technology Limited, who are probably the largest UK supplier of digital and online assessment now, but they were very involved in content production. So I was involved in working for UFI in developing key and basic skills courses, overseeing the development of those courses. And that kind of leads me, my journey to Bolton, in that I was working there and an opportunity. I just thought I need to do more. And a position was advertised in Bolton for an organisation called CETIS, which is Centre for Educational Technology and Interoperability Standards. And I thought, actually, I can do that. I've never been shy, or I've never had I know you've talked to other people about impostor syndrome. I've not had that. I've always believed I could do anything.
What's that like? You need to teach that.
Well, yeah, it's interesting because I'd always believed, and I recognised that as kind of a quite imposing, tall man. In that world, I had advantages that others didn't, and I recognised that. But I did use them. I tried to. Anyway, I'd seen this job at Bolton, and I came. In fact, there's another story. No, there isn't. I won't go down that one. But I came.
You've got to finish.
No, I won't that one. But I came to Bolton, and I was interviewed by a professor here, a guy called Oleg Lieber. And what I would say for the record is that of all people in my life, other than probably my parents, Oleg had greater influence on me. And I learned more from that man than anybody else. He was supportive. He took the decision to give me the job, to appoint me, when there were others that were certainly prima facie more qualified to do the job.
Wow.
And he gave me the job of managing CETIS. And I learned so much from that man. He was a socialist. He introduced me to cybernetics. My PhD, which I then started, was using cybernetic lens to look at digital education, particularly games and digital games, hence the connection there, on how we might use them as tools for teaching. And so my PhD became very, very focused on that. I rather took to the academic life. So I was very quickly became a director of CETIS. I then, when Oleg retired, took over the department from Oleg 12 years ago or whenever it was.
How different is this to the boy who didn't go to school and shoveled snow?
Well, yeah, it's interesting because Yeah, I was shoveling snow. I mean, people have asked me, what is the worst job that you've ever done? And, they think that if you're a professor and, you've gone through this very linear route to being a professor, you've not done hard work. Well, I have done hard work. I'll tell you, when I was in training in the military, I was on a ship called HMS Bulwark, which was an aircraft carrier that had been laid down in the Second World War. Very, very old. And I was, as a trainee, the first job that I had was what they call captain of the heads. Now, you wouldn't know what a captain of the heads is. No, you wouldn't. Well, if I tell you that the heads are the head of the ship and it's where the toilets are, and the toilets are called the heads, right? And so my job was cleaning the toilets at the sharp end of the ship, right? Captain of the heads, it sounded great, but that's what the job was. Oh. And so I had to clean toilets for 3 months at the front of the ship. Now, I'll tell you that a ship with 2,000 men on it, in the least hygienic part of that ship, and also I can tell you a lot about ship's plumbing, which would make your hair curl, but essentially it's based on a pressure system. So when the ship goes down and it's rough weather, exactly, the toilets or whatever's in them all pushes up. So you would go into the cubicles and the walls would be covered with whatever was in the toilet at the time or left in the toilet. And so I can tell you, it isn't an easy or very pleasant job. But when you've done that,
you can do anything.
Well, writing a paper is not the most challenging thing I've done in my life.
Oh, it seems rather easy, that, in comparison.
Yeah. So yeah. Again, these experiences though are really important, and I think, for anyone coming through the system, or that feels that, I haven't got enough, or feels self-doubt, then don't. And I also know that as a white man, it was historically easier for me to do that. Now things are getting better. The patriarchy, that system that existed when I was young, hasn't been broken, but it's been changed, and things are so much better for women and for others of diverse backgrounds. And so, I considered myself an outsider. I was working class, and working class in the sense that I was very proud of my working class upbringings and my value. And now that's often associated in a negative sense with toxic masculinity. I don't think it should be. There was an awful lot within those classes when I was young that we should be very, very proud of, and I am. And so back to CETUS, wherever we were. That's how I ended up at Bolton. I finished a PhD, and if you'd have said to this boy of 15, would you ever be called a doctor? I would have laughed at them. I didn't even know what a PhD was when I was 16. It hadn't crossed my mind. But actually, work hard. I did mine part-time when I was working at Bolton. And you can succeed. And if you set your mind to it, I know others have said about choosing something that you are passionate about and interested in. It's very easy in a PhD to lose interest, to kind of go off the rails a little bit. And that's the time to persevere. Because PhDs grow big and then grow very, very small and become more and more focused. And that was a good experience for me. I'll always be very, very thankful to Bolton for giving me the opportunity. Somebody in Bolton recognised something in me that maybe I didn't even recognise in myself. And I've worked with, when I was with CETIS, some exceptionally talented people. And I suppose I was a little bit like a sponge in that when you work with these people, when you're exposed to these different environments and these different ideas, you start developing. And I think as students, you know, I know, again, others have talked about specifically about qualifications, but I think in the broader sense, you start developing as a person. You start developing your own self-confidence. You equally, as I talked about self-discipline, you need to be self-disciplined in your study, particularly at postgraduate level, where there isn't so many people to guide and help you all of the time. And so I would say a PhD in itself is a good demonstration of self-discipline. And it proves that you're a safe pair of hands. You're taught techniques in which to consider problems, and those techniques will hold you in good stead, even if you decided you didn't necessarily want to pursue an academic career or you wanted to go into industry. Unfortunately, I still think we have some issues in industry that PhDs, people can be quite fearful of those of PhDs as being quote unquote too academic. Right. And, you know, I am very, very unusual in that I've gone through this very jagged path to academia. But those life experiences have all kind of helped me shape who I am. And I mean, now the work that I'm doing in the School of Arts, I've revisited, I'm a member of the Punk Scholars Network. So I kind of came back to that half a dozen years ago. So I'm now writing. I know a lot of people from those times, and so it's given me access from an academic perspective to conduct quite meaningful research into subcultures and how they behave, which is a real interest of mine. And working with some of those bands, we've got a fantastic project that I can't tell you about yet, but in Bolton for the photography and media students, which has come as a result of an old connection from mine from many, many years ago, who is now a large music promoter, very successful. And so I've been able to bring in all of those experiences into what I hope, you know, provides interesting experiences for our students. You know, and I take the view that all of our students, you know, from those on access courses to those doing their second PhD, are really important to us. In many ways, you know, I would rather, I love spending time talking to our students, and the role that I have allows me to kind of do that. I'm very fortunate. I don't have an exceptionally massive teaching load as many do in the university, that I'm very much focused on research activities. And so I can explore these really interesting things. But they're interesting things that I want to bring back into the institution and that others will benefit from. And I think I've had many opportunities over a number of years to look at other institutions, to work at them. But I'm really, I don't like the word pride. That's another a no-no for me. It's kind of, I'm very uncomfortable with notions of pride. But I am so kind of, Bolton's place as a place that allows, that supports you to develop as an, is something that we should be really, I'm going to use that word I don't like, proud of. We should be. And as an institution, I like that. I like the fact that it's inclusive. I like the fact that I'm working with people that have come from these, I'll call them these very jagged routes into wherever they are. You're an example yourself. Yeah. And I like that. You know, we've got great students, and we've got really enthusiastic staff. It's a pleasure to work with so many of them. So I'm thankful to key people in my life. I said Oleg Liebert, in terms of my academic, was such an inspiration. Introduced me to cybernetics, which has been the basis of the last 20 years of my work, really. Mr. Clough back in the school.
Yay, Mr. Clough!
yeah, I know, a big sounder. I actually saw him about 6 months ago.
No, you didn't.
And yeah, I did. And he was at the Woodlands pub, and he was having a pint. He's retired now, obviously. He's very old now. In the pub quiz. And I didn't know it was him at first. He said, "Hello, Paul, how are you going?" And I had a bit of a chat to him. And we won the pub quiz between us. So now I've got an encyclopedic memory for music, which is quite helpful. And there was a lot of that in there, as well as kind of my academic areas. But no, I've got a great job. I love working in the arts with our art students. I support the master's programs. I support PhDs in the university. And I know you and I have talked about this, and I can be a critical friend. And I enjoy that. And nothing gives you greater pleasure than seeing people come out of themselves and develop. And that's the thing that I like. And as I said, I've had so much help from so many people. And I've been really, really lucky in my life,
that's the really key message that I get from Bolton is, and I've said this before in previous podcasts, that it is just like a big family. You feel that sense of family there. And it's the fact that, I can talk to academics like this. I don't think other institutions perhaps will be so open.
No, and
I was scared of that, scared of conversation.
Well, I think it's important because, I don't like concepts of privilege. I mean, I'm for my sins, I'm also on the board of the Leeds Conservatoire, which is an HE institution. And so I've been also on other boards of universities and college groups, quite large ones. So I've got quite a bit of experience there. And what I found in the conservatoire is my great love is music, as is evident. And but bizarrely, I'll tell you another story if you've got a chance. But no, I'm writing a book at the moment about the Human League. And anyway, long story, I've got knowledge of the early Human League. They toured with the Banshees, and I kind of know Martin Ware of the Human League's a friend of mine. And so it's all kind of come together in this book. And I'm writing this book, and I am tasked with some American producers produced an album by the Human League called Crash in 1986. And they're very famous hip-hop American producers and R&B producers called Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis. And with my co-writer, a guy called David Buckley, another guy I'm learning so much from, who wrote David Bowie's biography, Kraftwerk, and various other people. And David said, well, how do we get interviews with Jam and Lewis? Because they really don't do them. They're kind of, they're at the highest level you can get in American society. And so anyway, a friend of mine who's on the board of conservatoires, a guy called Aaron Casserly-Stewart, lovely man. He's the chair of Black Lives Matters in the North. And I knew that he was lead singer in a band called Sounds of Blackness in America, an R&B band. Oh, Aaron, Jam and Lewis. Oh yeah, they were my producers. So again, but he said, I haven't spoken to them for a while, but I'll introduce you to my other friend who will arrange for this to happen. So he introduced me to this chap called Morris Hayes. And I'm thinking, oh, that's good of you. And I'm talking to him like I am to you. And it turned out that this chap is, or was, Prince's musical director for 20 years. And I've just been introduced to him, and I'm talking to him like I'm talking to you. and works with Jam and Lewis, with Stevie Wonder, with Whitney Houston, you name it, he kind of has worked with them. And again, out of the generosity of somebody else, all of these connections have been made that have allowed me to interview them for the book that's coming out. I've also written some academic text on the evolution of electronic music in Sheffield that's just been published, and it's in University of Bolton's repository now, so anyone who wants to access that, they can. But again, you know, I know others have talked about their journals and that kind of academic journey. Well, Bolton's a little bit different. Our trajectories as academics are quite different to that, you know, and our focus is on supporting our students, and I think that's quite right. And the research we do is focused on supporting them rather than necessarily in developing our individual reputations. And I've always had that view, you know, that, all right, I've published 80 odd articles, 90 articles. So yes, I do publish fairly regularly. Research projects into the university, I counted over the time that I've been, probably around £20 million. So it's you know, I've done that little bit of the academic bit, but it's, you know, how we interact, how we support with our students and our research, and the whole theory agenda, which I know some academics find difficult, should be around that, producing research that does help us teach and help us develop our students. And education is not about getting a PhD or getting an MSc or getting a first class honours. They're important, but it's about developing you as a person to maximise your potential. And that's not underplaying the disadvantages that all of us have in our lives, some more than others. And Bolton does that well.
Yes.
So maybe a little bit of a different take from perhaps that you've had from our other. Indeed, it would be very, very interesting, I think, as a development of this, to perhaps have not a conference, but perhaps some group discussions with those that are interested, with some of those that you've interviewed, about these very issues and their different perspectives on them. And they're all important.
That's a very good idea. Maybe we should facilitate that, yeah?
And I'm up for any debate about anything.
I love a good debate.
Yeah, exactly.
So, you started this by saying that you had not a conventional route and a very diverse route, and I think it's fair to say that you have.
Yeah, I recognise that, but again, I'm not going to downplay any of those life experiences because they've been critical, and I think, you know, perhaps doing what I do now more than anything, you recognise the value in those things. Yeah. So when somebody comes and tells me they're really, really struggling with this, I get it. You know, I've kind of been there. You know, I did tell you I didn't get any A levels. Well, I am fibbing.
Yes, you've got an accidental A level.
I got an accidental A level. I have an A level in naval history.
Oh.
I don't think it's one they do now. And I did that because I was bored. And I studied that when I was in the Navy, when I was in the South Atlantic. And I had to do a second series of patrols down there, which led me for being down there for a long, long time. And I thought, well, I'll be bored stupid if I can't find something to do in my downtime to keep and so I did this history A level, naval history A level. So I feel equally adept at talking about the nuances of the victories and defeats at the Battle of Jutland in 1916. And again, that kind of came back because one of the other things that I've done as well in the cultural sector, I've been chair of a Museums and Galleries Trust, which I've done alongside my work. And interestingly, there we talk about life experiences. Very recently, the museum which I was chair of commissioned work on the bombardment of Scarborough in 1916 by the German Navy. And it took a perspective both from the German Navy and from the British perspective. And so I was involved in that work, and the German delegation were quite surprised that I knew the particular ships that had bombarded Scarborough in 1914, which is when it occurred, Scarborough and Hartlepool. It's not widely known. There was a naval attack on Britain. And of course, I knew about this, and I knew the ships, and I knew their command infrastructures. And I think they were quite shocked that the chair of a galleries trust would know all these things about the Navy. But now you know my story, you can kind of understand why. And I studied the what was the German battle fleet of 1916 as part of that naval history A-level. So, if we have a discussion on the relative powers and merits of pre-Second World War German and Royal Navies, I can equally hold my own in those, or the post-war and Cold War.
Like the next conversation.
No. So all of these things have kind of merged into shaping. Yeah. And as said, I really enjoy the work I'm doing in the arts and culture. It's great to see people develop, and Bolton is a really interesting place to do it. I was a bit wary before I came to Bolton. I'm still not resident. I don't think. I've never been resident in Bolton, but I've been involved now 19 years. So it's quite some time. I've got to know the institution, how it works, and I've got to know our students. And I've done a little bit of work. I did a podcast recently with Ange, the student union leader, which was a great pleasure to do. I enjoyed that.
He asked me to do one of them, and oh my gosh, I was so nervous because I'm okay asking the questions, but not being asked the questions. I hated it.
Well, that's a typical police officer.
Yes.
We ask questions. We don't like being challenged ourselves. But no, I've had one or two run-ins with the police in various guises over many years. Oh God, yeah. I do remember. I'm still quite passionate about Orgreave and the miners and the inquiry there and the behaviour. So yeah, I support the campaign to get a judicial inquiry into what occurred there.
Absolutely.
Which I think was highly political and very important. We get to the bottom of it. So so I've put, I guess, challenged authority is probably a consistent theme.
Is it the kind of way of putting it?
Yeah. Always challenged authority throughout my career and pre-career. But I still think I'm more the apprentice to the court jester than a student of physics. That's stayed with me.
Apprentice to the court jester. That's probably how we're going to put your title now on this podcast.
There you go. But again, hopefully, there's somebody there. If one person sees this and said, "Oh, I recognise that,"
yeah,
that's okay. That's good. And I'm more than happy to talk to any of our students about anything if ever they want.
Brilliant. Well, I think we're going to leave it there. But thank you so much. I'm just going to press stop on the recording. Thank you so much for your time.
Oh, thank you. Pleasure.